Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and I'm so excited to show you 3 different ways to quilt the same large quilt on your home sewing machine. In my brand new book, How Do I Quilt It, I include 9 fabulous quilts that you can make. On this week's video, I'm going to go into detail on one of the 3 quilt patterns shown behind me called daisy chain. I include 3 different quilting plans in the book for you to follow along, and I'm going to show you how to break down the process. First, I'll show you how to quilt radiating lines with your walking foot. Then I'll show you an all-over free motion design that's super easy to stitch called Doodle Flowers. And finally, I'll show you the custom quilting plan that uses your walking foot and free motion. It's called Chain Links and would really work well for lots of different quilts. My book goes into great detail showing you step-by-step how to make each of the 3 patterns included in the book. It includes step-by-step photos, extra bonus tips, and plenty of full-color diagrams with as many tips and tricks as I could throw in there. Now I'll share some in-progress images and videos showing how I made this same quilt 3 different times with 3 different quilting plans. I used the same fabric colors for all 3 versions of this quilt with slightly different fabrics and different arrangements in the quilt. I really wanted you to see what the same quilt would look like and only focus on the different quilting plans. The colorful prints are from custom color bundles that I put together from all of my different fabric lines, and I paired them up with 3 different light backgrounds that all read white or gray, so it'd be really easy to pull from your stash. I used a couple of different navies for the block chains in each quilt, and I arranged the blocks in order on my design wall to keep track of their placement while I sewed it together. I tell you, my sewing room gets quite messy when I'm in the middle of a project, but it's a fun mess. I've also included a whole section on my spray basting technique with step-by-step photos, and I give bonus tips on how to make a piece backing or how to sew a backing from one fabric with just a couple of seams. Once your quilt top is basted and ready to go, it's time to pick threads, make your quilting plan, give it a little practice, and start quilting. For all 3 versions of daisy chain, I've pieced and quilted them using my Aurifil thread collections in colors, neutrals, and variegated. These are all 50 weight, 100% cotton, which is soft and supple, and it sinks into the quilt. This means flatter seams and more dimension when machine quilting. This neutral blends in nicely with the colorful prints. To quilt radiating lines that emanate across the quilt, I randomly placed pieces of painter's tape across the diagonal of the quilt, and I stitched along one or both sides of the tape. I did this with my dual feed system, but you can also do it with a walking foot. After quilting each pass of lines, I reused the tape over and over again, and I lifted it up anytime the lines overlapped. This design adds a ton of texture to the quilt, and the best part is it can be completely irregular and imperfect. The hardest part is knowing when to stop. In the book, I also included lots of bonus ideas for each and every quilting motif. For example, instead of quilting straight lines, you can quilt wavy lines instead. You're going to have a plethora of designs from which to choose. I chose one of my variegated threads in blue for all over free motion doodle designs because I knew that would blend in with most of the fabric in the quilt. It takes about 1 large spool for the top and another for the bobbin to quilt this large quilt densely, but you can use 2 similar value threads also. Because this is such a large quilt, the secret to dealing with the bulk is having a nice large drop-in sewing table that can hold up the weight of the quilt while you stitch. Here's a close-up showing how I quilted this design. I'm randomly stitching loops in opposite directions, and then every now and then I'm throwing in a whimsical 4-petaled flower. I break this design down in the book, and I recommend sketching out the design on paper first to get a feel for how it ebbs and flows, then quilt it on a practice sample before trying it on the real quilt. It's a very fun and forgiving design to stitch, and I really like how the variegated thread adds sparkle to the design. When quilting a meandering design like this, I'm moving all over the blocks regardless of the piece design. However, this is a really great design that's going to help obscure any imperfections in the quilt, especially if some of your seams don't line up. Right now, I'm quilting at actual speed, but I'll go ahead and speed things up for you for a little bit so that you can see me covering more of the area of the quilt. I pressed all of my seams open so that it's easy to move around the quilt from block to block and it doesn't get hung up on thick intersections. My feed dogs are dropped and I'm using a specialty free motion foot with an open toe so that I can see what I'm doing. Notice how often I reposition my hands so that I'm always stitching in between them. The gloves help me grip the quilt so that it can slide around smoothly and freely. My table underneath is pretty slick, so there's not much friction or drag on the quilt. If you have a stitch regulator, that can also help you quilt in a smooth, fluid manner with more even stitches. I'm actually not using a regulator because I learned to quilt without one, and that's what I'm used to. And I also want to show that you don't necessarily have to have high-end specialty equipment to get good results. Now here's a top-down view showing how my table really helps hold up the quilt while I move around. You can see a little bit of my messy sewing room, but this is me on location in my actual sewing room and I love it here. Now I'm only focusing on one block area at a time and I break down the quilting plan block by block. Just remember, you aren't quilting an entire queen-size quilt all at once. You're only quilting a few inches of it at a time in a methodical way. Basically, for every quilting plan that I follow, I start on the right-hand side of the quilt and I work my way towards the center, rotate the quilt, and then stitch back to the other side. I discuss that in more detail in the book also. Here's another close-up showing more of the doodle flowers design stitched in the background. Now another tip when it comes to choosing fabrics and quilting motifs. If it's a new design that you are unsure of, choose busy fabrics to hide your imperfections. Or choose fabrics that read more solid if you want your beautiful quilting to show. If you'd like to estimate how long a certain design will take to quilt, time yourself while quilting a practice block, then multiply that by the number of blocks in the quilt. I love to quilt densely because it hides my imperfections, and by using natural fiber materials in all 3 layers of the quilt, it will be soft and snuggly. And here are some finished shots of the machine quilting. For the custom quilting plan, I used a combination of straight line anchor quilting and then free motion decorative quilting to give this quilt that wow factor that really pops. I used a combination of neutral silvery thread and variegated blue thread to really give this quilt depth and sparkle. I started by quilting straight lines across the diagonals and all of the chains in both directions. And I quilted straight lines on both sides of the chains as well. You can either eyeball your lines and quilt them straight-ish, or if you'd like precise line placement, you can place tape in the middle of each chain section and then stitch with your needle right next to the tape. Now, if you don't need precise line placement, you can put the edge of your foot next to the tape instead. And you know what? If you stitch on top of your tape, that's okay. You can just gently pull it off and you won't have any issues and it won't gum up your needle. Once I anchor quilted all the chains in both directions, I decided that I wanted to go ahead and stitch in the ditch around each of the chain squares to keep them from poofing up too much. You'll notice that I haven't marked every single quilting design on my quilting plan. It's just a roadmap to follow. Remember, the whole point of this book, How Do I Quilt It, is going to answer that question for you, and you get to decide which designs you want to put and where. I'm just giving you a few recipes that I know that'll work. I usually end up quilting more densely than what it shows in my plans, but by breaking down the design steps, you can decide at any time that you want to add more quilting or less quilting and mix and match your designs. Rather than having to start and stop around each blue square, I quilted on one side of each long row of chains, rotating the quilt as I went, and then I went back and quilted on the other side. I'm always looking for the longest continuous quilting line that I can make to minimize the number of starts and stops. In the book, I also give you lots of exercise for practice and how to break the designs down on individual practice blocks. After all of the straight line quilting, I switched to free motion to quilt concentric continuous curves in the pinwheel blocks and stipple in the background. In the book, there's also a gallery of machine quilting designs that you can quilt with your walking foot or free motion, and you can actually practice on real quilt blocks before you're ready to take that to the actual quilt. Here's an in-progress shot of the large quilt shoved underneath the machine. The last step was to add pebbles next to the blue squares to keep the design evenly dense throughout the quilt. It definitely takes longer to custom quilt this densely, but by breaking it down one step and one design motif at a time, you'll feel accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Well, I hope you enjoyed seeing those 3 quilting plans in the book. Remember, there's dozens of different quilting motifs that you can try. You can mix and match them for endless possibilities. Now, when it comes to finishing your quilts, I actually prefer the look of hand binding, but in the book, I also include some tips on finishing your quilts either by hand or by machine. Several of the patterns lend themselves to using leftovers, or you can always use the same fabric for a continuous binding all the way around your quilt. Once my binding is sewn on the front of the quilt by machine, I'll press it away from the quilt with a hot dry iron to make it easier to attach to the back. Then I'll secure it with binding clips all the way around to hold the quilt in place, and then I can stitch by hand or machine. I love taking handwork with me on vacation, so I'll try to save a binding or 2 to take with me on my next trip. I stitch from right to left with the quilt spread out in front of me. A metal thimble helps me push the needle through with each and every stitch. However, I've also seen people do this 180 degrees different and stitching from left to right. There's no wrong way to stitch as long as it feels comfortable to you. I'm using that Aurifil cotton thread. It's the same type that I piece and quilt with. I'm just using color to match my binding fabric, and I'm just using 1 thread. If you're a little worried about that, you can always double up your thread while stitching. I'm taking 1 stitch at a time using a blind hem stitch. I basically grab a bit of the backing and then slide the needle right on the fold of the binding to keep it as hidden as possible. My stitches are small and tight so they won't come undone, and I'm just using a small needle that I got from a variety pack. Well, there you have it, 3 different ideas for quilting the same quilt. So remember, in my book, there's 3 different patterns quilted 3 different ways. This is just one of them. Be sure to stay tuned to my other videos where I break down the process showing the other 2 patterns, and I'm actually using different fabrics. You can also check out my other video where I give you a virtual trunk show of all the quilts in the book. All of that fun stuff is over on my YouTube channel, conveniently located at kristaquilts.tv. And if you want to get a copy of the book, you can pick that up, and I'll even sign it for you at shop.kristaquilts.com. Be sure to grab a copy of my book, and you're well on your way to becoming a better quilter, I promise. Until next time, happy quilting!